The Galactic Hegemony made one fatal mistake. They confused our silence for surrender. While they prepared for an easy conquest, we were rewiring the physics of our home. We've turned the entire solar system into a magnetic railgun, and our first shot is about to erase their entire armada from existence. Grand Marshal Wei Ashun Kor had a folder for humanity. It was one of the thinnest folders in his archive, 30 years of silence, filed under species that had either surrendered quietly or died quietly enough not to matter. He had spent 40 solar cycles cataloging the failure states of primitive powers, empires that burned out on internal conflict, militaries that collapsed the first time they met a hegemony dreadnought. Humanity's folder had never given him anything to add to that pattern. Until today. "Run it again," he said, looking at the schematic rotating on the display of the Aurelian word. 3 kilometers of layered plating and directed energy batteries, arranged around a command philosophy that hadn't needed revision in 6 centuries. "Marshal, we have run it." "Run it again." The analyst ran it again. The number didn't change. It never changed. And that was the part that sat wrong in a way he didn't yet have language for. 4 of the inner planets had drifted out of their natural orbits, locked into a magnetic resonance with their star that no natural process could explain. "Long-range sensors are picking up induced planetary drift," his tactical officer reported, choosing his words like a man laying stepping stones across ice. "Multiple bodies. The pattern isn't natural. Someone recalculated it. Deliberately." Wei Ashun stared at the schematic. He had seen species build ring stations, Dyson swarms, generation ships large enough to house nations. He had never seen a species treat an entire solar system as a single piece of machined equipment. The scale didn't offend him. The hegemony had built structures of comparable size. What unsettled him was the purpose. You built a ring station to live in. You built a Dyson swarm to harvest. There was only one reason to nudge 4 planets into resonance around an ignited star, and it wasn't habitation. "They've built a railgun," he said, and heard how strange the words sounded even as he spoke them. "They've built a railgun the size of a solar system." No one on the deck responded. It was the silence of a room full of trained officers independently arriving at the same impossible arithmetic and finding no error in it. Wei Ashun had built his career on a simple, reliable rule. Species revealed their intentions long before they had the capability to act on them. You watched the shipyards. You watched the recruitment numbers. You watched the diplomatic tone shift from conciliatory to defiant, in careful, measurable increments, and you adjusted your posture accordingly. It was not a perfect system, but it had never once failed to give him warning. It had failed here, not because the warning signs hadn't existed. His analysts reviewing the archive afterward would find dozens of them, scattered across 2 decades of low-priority sensor logs and unread physics journals. But because no one had been watching closely enough to string them together. Humanity hadn't hidden what it was doing. It simply hadn't announced it, and the hegemony's entire intelligence apparatus had been built to listen for announcements. Around him, the bridge of the Aurelian word carried on with the particular disciplined quiet of a crew that had trained together long enough to sense, without being told directly, that something in the room had shifted. His navigation officer, a younger hegemony native named Threl Vasenko, kept glancing between the schematic and the marshal's face, looking for the cue that would tell her how seriously to take what she was seeing. Wei Ashun did not give her one, not because he wanted to withhold it, but because he genuinely did not yet know what the correct level of alarm was. He had spent 40 years learning to calibrate his reactions to the size of the threat in front of him. He had never before needed to calibrate a reaction to a threat whose size he could not yet even estimate. "Pull everything we have on the Sol system's economic output for the last 3 decades, he said finally. "Shipping manifests, resource extraction figures, anything on record." The request came back within the hour, and it told him almost nothing new, which was, in its own way, the most unsettling part of all. Humanity's economy had not visibly militarized. There had been no obvious diversion of resources into weapons production that any standard analytical model would have flagged. Whatever had been spent on the cradle had been absorbed, patiently and invisibly, into 2 decades of unremarkable infrastructure spending, the kind no analyst was ever trained to treat as suspicious. 22 years earlier, the hegemony had delivered its final ultimatum, with the flat procedural confidence of an empire accustomed to compliance, tribute, resource concessions, the dismantling of 3 research stations near the edge of contested space. 90 days. Humanity didn't respond. That on its own wasn't remarkable. Species facing overwhelming force often went quiet before capitulating. What should have been flagged and wasn't, because the analyst responsible had been reassigned mid-cycle and no one ever picked the thread back up, was what humanity did with the silence. They didn't evacuate. They didn't scatter into a defensive posture. They didn't negotiate from manufactured strength. They built. Orbital shipyards that had spent a decade producing modest defensive cruisers were quietly retooled for something hegemony satellites classified, when they bothered classifying it at all, as large-scale civilian infrastructure. Reports of unusual electromagnetic activity around the inner planets were filed under a low-priority tag and left unread for 4 years. A joint research consortium published a dense, unglamorous paper on large-scale magnetic containment of planetary cores in an obscure open-access physics journal that no hegemony analyst had ever been assigned to monitor. The hegemony had built an empire on the assumption that any civilization worth taking seriously would announce itself. Humanity built a solar system's worth of quiet certainty on the opposite assumption. We didn't go quiet because we were scared, Dr. Amara Ose, lead architect of what became known internally as Project Cradle, said years later, in an interview she only gave because her daughter asked her to. We went quiet because we were busy. There's a difference, and it took the rest of the galaxy 22 years to notice it. The public, when it eventually learned the shape of what had been built in its name, had its own quiet reckoning to work through. Ose described sitting in front of a Joint Defense Council subcommittee, years into the project, fielding a question she'd expected since the day she signed on. How had they kept something this large secret from their own population for over 2 decades, in open, nominally democratic societies? We didn't keep it secret, she said. We kept it boring. Nobody reads a 20-year infrastructure appropriations bill for the drama. Nobody watches a live feed of a magnetic containment array holding steady at spec. The secret was never a vault with a combination. It was thousands of people doing careful, undramatic work in plain sight, and a species that had, for once, decided not to make a spectacle out of its own ambition. That answer, when it finally reached the wider public, did not satisfy everyone. There had been, in the years leading up to disclosure, occasional public debates about the appropriations bills Ose described, modest controversies, quickly resolved, about the scale of orbital infrastructure spending relative to more visible domestic priorities. A handful of elected representatives had, at various points, questioned the returns on investment for programs whose stated purposes sounded, on paper, unremarkable to the point of dullness: magnetic field research, deep core survey initiatives, long-duration orbital stability studies. None of those debates had risen to the level of genuine political controversy, in part because the people asking the hardest questions were, more often than not, the very officials who had been read into the project's true purpose and had chosen, deliberately, to let the boring cover story do its work. It was, several of them admitted afterward, one of the more uncomfortable ethical compromises of their careers. Governing for 2 decades, with a truth they could not share with the people who had elected them, on the theory that the alternative was a truth the hegemony would learn just as easily and far sooner. The principle was simple to state and monstrous to execute. A conventional railgun accelerates a conductive projectile down parallel rails using a magnetic field generated by current flowing through them. There was no theoretical ceiling on the technique. Only an engineering ceiling, the kind humans had spent 2 centuries getting uncomfortably good at solving. You couldn't build rails 100 million kilometers long out of conventional materials. But you could, with enough patience, nudge 4 rocky planets into stable magnetic resonance around their star, using their own metallic cores as the current-carrying medium, and use the star itself, not ignited but coaxed, its magnetic output shaped with millimeter precision across 4 planetary bodies and 11 artificial containment stations, as the power source. The projectile itself was the least complicated part of the whole system. A slug of asteroid belt material, unremarkable in composition, remarkable only in what 22 years of magnetic acceleration across planetary distances could do to its velocity. People think the hard part was making something big enough to matter, said Chief Engineer Tomasz Winiarski, who'd spent 9 years on the containment array before most of his colleagues even knew what project he was working on. The hard part was making something that big hold together long enough to work. Anyone can build a bomb. We built a system that had to run for 2 decades without a single catastrophic failure, because a catastrophic failure at this scale doesn't destroy a lab. It destroys a planet. Ours. There had been near misses buried now as footnotes. In year 6, a containment fluctuation on the second planet's northern array came within an estimated 90 seconds of a resonance cascade that would have destabilized the planet's magnetic field permanently, ending the project and the habitability of everything living on that continent. The 11 engineers on shift that day worked the checklist in the order it was written, without skipping steps, without shortcuts born of panic, and brought the array back into tolerance with 4 seconds to spare. The shift supervisor's log entry read, in its entirety, fluctuation resolved, resuming schedule. No commendations were issued, no press release followed. When asked years later why the incident had never been publicized, she said doing so would have implied it was remarkable, and the entire point of the project had been to make catching your own mistakes before they became disasters feel like Tuesday. One of those 11 engineers, a materials specialist named Riva Okonkwo-Lindqvist, later described the 90 seconds not as heroic, but as almost mundane in the moment. A strange thing to say about 90 seconds that could have ended a civilization, but one she stood by every time she was asked to elaborate. Heroic is a word you use afterward, when you have time to be frightened by what almost happened, she said. In the room there wasn't time to be frightened. There was a sequence of steps, and a sequence of steps has a next step, and you do the next step, and then the one after that, until either the problem is solved or it isn't. Fear is a thing that happens before and after. It doesn't have anywhere to live in the middle of the actual work. In year 11, a diplomatic aide with access to preliminary project summaries nearly leaked partial details to a hegemony-aligned information broker. He was caught not by counterintelligence, but by a junior systems analyst who noticed an anomaly in query logs that didn't match any authorized research pattern, and spent 3 unpaid weekends confirming her suspicion before she ever filed a report. The Great Quiet held. Nobody outside a small classified review board ever learned her name either. In year 17, a routine planetary alignment survey by an unaffiliated astronomical group flagged the same orbital anomalies the hegemony would eventually notice 5 years later, and published their findings, briefly, before a coordinated and entirely legal campaign of counter-publications, alternative modeling papers, and quietly funded peer review, buried the original result under a mountain of competing, more boring explanations. Nobody lied. Nobody suppressed anything outright. The truth simply got lost in a sea of plausible, uninteresting alternatives, the way a single fact often does when nobody watching has a reason to look twice. By year 20, the project had grown to encompass over 400,000 people across a dozen agencies, contractors, and research institutions, spread across every inhabited body in the Sol system. And yet the internal audits, conducted annually by a rotating oversight committee sworn to secrecy under penalties few of them ever expected to actually face, found remarkably few breaches of protocol. Winiarski, asked once how a project of that scale had managed to keep its true purpose contained for so long, offered an answer that struck outsiders as almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. "We told people the truth about the parts that mattered to them," he said. The technician calibrating a containment sensor on the third planet didn't need to know she was building a weapon. She needed to know that her sensor had to hold tolerance to 4 decimal places and that getting it wrong could kill everyone on her crew. That was true. It was the whole truth she needed. Most secrets fail because people try to hide the big picture from everyone. We just made sure nobody needed the big picture to do their job well. 22 years held together by hundreds of thousands of people whose names never appeared in any headline, because the alternative to quiet competence was a headline nobody wanted to be the subject of. If the setups got you hooked, drop a like. It genuinely helps a small channel like this one. All right. Back to it. The Hegemony fleet arrived 11 days after the first anomaly report. 41 vessels arranged in the wide defensive lattice formation reserved for engagements against opponents whose capabilities weren't fully mapped. It was the first time in Wei Ashun's career he'd needed to deploy that formation against a species with no combat record, against Hegemony forces at all. He hailed the system on the standard frequency. The response came from a modest, unarmed relay station near the fourth planet. Not a warship, not a command vessel, just a communications platform with a single human officer whose feed showed a small, sparse office and a mug of something steaming on the desk beside her. "This is Fleet Admiral Priya Kaur, Joint Defense Council, speaking for the Sol system," she said. Her tone was level, unhurried, the tone of someone reading a weather report rather than addressing an invasion force. "You're currently inside what we're calling the resonance envelope. I'd like to explain what that means before anyone does anything we can't walk back. 22 years ago, you gave us 90 days to comply with a set of demands. We didn't respond, because we weren't deciding whether to comply. We were building the only kind of answer we thought you'd actually listen to. It's finished now. We'd genuinely prefer not to use it. That preference has an expiration date, and it's tied to how long your fleet stays inside this envelope. You have 20 minutes to begin withdrawal before the next recharge cycle completes." She had rehearsed the words more times than she'd admit to anyone on the council, alone in that same small office in the years leading up to this exact moment. Not because she doubted what she'd say, but because she understood, better than most, that the words themselves would be the last purely human thing to happen in this engagement. After this, the physics took over, and physics didn't rehearse. It simply arrived on schedule. She had spent 4 years as liaison between the project's engineers and the council, translating one into the language of the other, and she had learned in that time that the hardest part of her job was never explaining what the cradle could do. It was convincing careful, cautious people that a weapon capable of ending a war in one shot was not, in itself, a reason to fire it more than once. That restraint, applied at exactly the right moment, could do more work than force ever could. She believed that. She had built her entire strategy for this day around believing it. She was about to find out, in the space of the next 20 minutes, whether the rest of the galaxy was capable of believing it too. She ended the transmission there, without waiting for a response. 3 decks below him, junior sensor operator Des Koravan, 24 years old, 3 service cycles into a career she'd chosen for the tidy, solvable nature of sensor, mathematics, and known already for a habit of double-checking settled conclusions that her superiors kept telling her to grow out of. Ran the resonance envelope numbers a second time on her own console, independent of the Marshal's analysts, using a modeling approach she'd picked up in training rather than the standard Hegemony tactical suite. She got, within a margin too small to be comforting, the same terrible answer. She flagged it immediately, through the correct channels in the correct format, and then did the thing her training had never quite prepared her for. She sat with the knowledge that she'd done everything right, and that it might still not be enough, because the order she'd helped confirm had several more links of command left to travel before it reached anyone who could act on it. She spent those minutes doing the only other thing available to her, running the numbers a third time, then a fourth, hunting for the error she desperately hoped was there, because an error would have meant this was a problem she could fix from her own console instead of a fact she could only watch unfold. She did not find one. Around her, the tactical deck carried on with its ordinary business, officers murmuring status updates in the clipped, professional cadence of a crew that had not yet been told there was anything to be alarmed about. And she found herself, for the first time in her short career, genuinely unsure whether the silence in that room was a comfort or the loneliest thing she'd ever experienced. Wei Ashun spent his first 5 minutes verifying the claim. His analysts confirmed it with visibly growing discomfort. He spent the next 5 assuming Kaur was bluffing, because bluffing was what his species' entire diplomatic doctrine expected from a technologically inferior opponent negotiating from weakness. He spent his final 10 staring at 4 planets bent gently and deliberately out of their orbits over 2 decades of patient, silent work, and arrived, reluctantly, and far too late to matter, at the only conclusion that fit. A species capable of that kind of patience wasn't a species that bluffed. Bluffing required urgency. Everything about the cradle argued for the opposite. He gave the order to withdraw with 4 minutes remaining on the clock. It didn't reach the fleet in time, not from any failure in his command chain, but because Battle Commander Resathal, aboard the escort cruiser 9th Resolve, had spent the preceding 16 minutes convinced that the correct hegemony response to an unverified threat from an inferior species was to demonstrate resolve, not caution. She began moving her weapons batteries into firing position against the relay station, a station she correctly identified as undefended and incorrectly identified as therefore harmless to attack. She would say in the review that followed that she hadn't believed the threat was real. Not really. 22 years of hegemony doctrine had taught her that inferior species postured because posturing was the only weapon they had, and that the correct response to posturing was to make clear, early and unambiguously, that it wouldn't work. She had made that judgment the way she'd made 100 others across her career, quickly and with confidence, because quick, confident judgment was what her rank was supposed to look like. She did not have time, in the 16 minutes she spent arriving at that judgment, to ask herself what she would do differently if she turned out to be wrong. There had never before been a scenario where being wrong cost this much. She fired 11 seconds before the Grand Marshal's withdrawal order reached her console. The station's shields absorbed the strike without so much as a flicker on Kor's feed. That was unwise, Kor said, to no one in particular, and then to the system at large, in a transmission that reached every hegemony vessel simultaneously. Envelope recharge complete. Firing solution locked. This is the last thing I'm going to say before we do this. This isn't retaliation for one shot from one commander who didn't get the memo in time. It's the answer to the ultimatum you gave us 22 years ago. What happened next took, by the instrument logs later released to the Joint Defense Council's public archive, 4.1 seconds from initiation to impact, a number that would go on to become one of the most quoted statistics of the post-war era, precisely because of how small it was relative to what it accomplished. The projectile crossed the distance between the firing point and the hegemony fleet's defensive lattice, at a velocity that rendered the fleet's targeting systems functionally useless. There was no interception window, no evasive maneuver with a non-zero chance of success. It didn't need to be aimed at individual ships. The kinetic shockwave of its passage through the lattice was sufficient on its own. 9 vessels destroyed outright, 14 more crippled by structural failure. The remaining 18, including the Aurelian Word, damaged in proportion to how close their assigned position had placed them to the projectile's path, a formation built entirely around minimizing risk from directed energy fire, which had never needed to account for a solid mass moving at a meaningful fraction of light speed, because no one had ever built anything capable of delivering one. Veashun watched it happen from a bridge that had lost primary power, secondary power, and 11% of its crew before he'd fully processed that the projectile had already passed through the formation and continued into open space, its trajectory unaltered, its work in this system apparently already complete. For the 4 seconds the strike lasted, the Aurelian Word itself had done nothing at all. No evasive maneuver had been possible, no countermeasure had engaged, because none of its systems had detected the threat in time to attempt one. The ship's automated defense suite, designed and refined over centuries to intercept incoming energy weapons at a range that gave it time to compute a response, registered the projectile's arrival and its departure within the same diagnostic cycle, and logged the entire event with a kind of mechanical helplessness Veashun found more unsettling than any of the damage reports that followed, as a single line: threat detected, threat no longer present, no action taken. Status, he said into a bridge answering him in the reduced, careful voices of people whose training hadn't prepared them for this category of aftermath. "We're alive, Marshal," his tactical officer said. "Half the fleet isn't." Aboard the 9th Resolve, Battle Commander Thal had been thrown clear across her own bridge by the shockwave, and came back to consciousness to a hull groaning under stresses her ship's specifications insisted it shouldn't be capable of surviving. Her ship had survived, barely, at the outer edge of the lattice, spared the worst of the passage by a margin she would later learn was measured in mere kilometers. 9 of her fellow commanders had not been so fortunate. She would carry that arithmetic for the rest of her career, that her own unauthorized shot, fired from a position of confident, practiced certainty, had changed nothing about the outcome except which ships happened to be standing closest to a line she hadn't known existed until it was already drawn. Her formal review, when it came months later, did not remove her from service, though it ended any prospect of the command she had once been on track for. The board's finding was, in its own quiet way, harder to sit with than a dismissal would have been. That her judgment in that moment had been unremarkable. The exact judgment hegemony doctrine had spent 6 centuries training its officers to make under pressure, applied correctly by the standards that existed before that day. The board did not absolve her of the order. It simply noted, in language that would echo through hegemony tactical academies for a generation afterward, that an institution which trained its officers to answer uncertainty with confident force rather than confirmed information, could not fairly ask any single officer to have been the first to do otherwise. He looked at the tactical display, 9 friendly icons gone dark in the same 4 seconds, 14 more flashing amber, and thought, with the strange, detached clarity that sometimes arrives at the exact center of a crisis too large to process at once, that he'd spent his entire career studying species who lost wars by underestimating the hegemony's strength. He had just become the first hegemony commander in 6 centuries to lose half a fleet by underestimating someone else's patience. 3 decks down, Des Corrivan felt the shockwave arrive before the alarms finished registering it. A single enormous groan through the Aurelian word's superstructure, the sound a ship makes when asked, without warning, to absorb forces its designers never modeled for. She ran a damage assessment out of pure reflex and found numbers that didn't resemble any simulation she'd ever run. 9 transponders simply absent from the network, not damaged, gone, the way a word disappears when you delete it rather than cross it out. Confirm no secondary object inbound, her supervisor said, his voice thinner than she'd ever heard it. There was no secondary object. There didn't need to be. Whatever the humans had built was designed to make its point in a single, unambiguous sentence, and then say nothing further. And the silence afterward frightened her considerably more than the strike itself had. Across the fleet, the same silence settled over ship after ship as damage reports came in. Crews who had trained for years against directed energy engagements with warning shots, escalating exchanges, room to adjust and recover, found themselves instead sifting through the wreckage of something that had happened and finished happening before most of them had understood it was happening at all. There was no enemy fleet closing to press the advantage. There was no follow-up barrage. There was simply the fact of the strike, complete and unrepeated, and an admiral on an unarmed relay station waiting to see what the survivors would do next. Fei-Ashun made the crossing to the relay station himself, against the advice of his surviving command staff, because somewhere in the 11 hours since the strike, he'd decided he owed the person on the other side of this a direct conversation rather than a formally transmitted capitulation document. "You could have fired again," he said, once the brief formalities were done. 11 hours later. "You had a second recharge window. You didn't use it." "No," Kor agreed. "Why?" "Because the point was never how many of your ships we could remove from the board. It was making clear we could remove all of them, and then not doing it, because the demonstration only means something if the restraint after it is real. Fire twice, and we're just a bigger version of the thing you already understood. A stronger fist answers a stronger fist eventually. We didn't build the cradle to win an arms race. We built it so we'd never have to be in one again." Fei-Ashun let that sit. His training had spent 40 years preparing him to anticipate an opponent's escalation. None of it had prepared him for an opponent's deliberate restraint, and the second thing was proving, in practice, far harder to sit with than the first. He studied her for a long moment, and found himself doing something he had not done in front of an adversary in longer than he could remember, reassessing, in real time, an entire framework he had assumed was settled. Hegemony doctrine held that power, left unchecked, would always eventually be used because power that went unused was, in the strictest military sense, indistinguishable from power that did not exist. It was a doctrine that had never once been tested against a species willing to build the largest weapon in galactic history, and then treat its unused potential as the entire point. He did not yet know what to do with that. He suspected it would take him considerably longer than the remainder of this conversation to find out. "May I ask something outside the formal record?" he said. "Battle Commander Thal fired without authorization, 11 seconds before my withdrawal order would have reached her. If she'd waited, would you still have fired?" "Yes," Kor said without hesitation, and there was something almost gentle in the bluntness of it. "I want to be honest about that. 20 minutes was the withdrawal window. It expired. Her shot didn't cause the strike. It just meant it arrived attached to a smaller, more forgivable story than the one it would have arrived attached to otherwise. If your whole fleet had simply sat there for 20 minutes doing nothing, the outcome doesn't change. I don't want your council spending the next decade blaming one officer for a decision that was never actually hers to make." Fei-Shun absorbed that in silence. It would have been easier to keep the comfortable version, one subordinate's impatience as the deciding factor. She'd taken that version away from him deliberately, at no cost to herself, and he understood, turning it over, that this too was the same restraint she'd described a moment earlier. "Commander Thal will still face review," he said. "Her order was unauthorized regardless of what would have happened without it. That's your call. I'd only ask that whatever your council decides, it decides it for the right reasons. Insubordination is worth addressing on its own terms. It's not the reason 9 of your ships aren't answering hails anymore." There was a silence after that, the kind that neither of them seemed inclined to fill immediately. Fei-Shun looked, for the first time since boarding the station, less like a defeated commander delivering a formal capitulation, and more like a man doing the private arithmetic of a career he'd need to entirely reconsider. "Your council will ask you the same question mine will ask me," he said eventually. "Whether this was a singular event or whether your species intends to keep building weapons of this scale." "They'll get the same answer either way," Kor said. "We built exactly one. We're not building another. Not because we've decided the galaxy is safe now, it isn't, but because the cradle only works as a deterrent, if the whole point of it is that we never wanted to need it in the first place. A species that builds a second one starts looking like a species that likes having one. We'd rather be the species that spent 22 years hoping it would never have to use the first." "And if we build one of our own?" Fei-Shun asked, "given time enough to attempt it?" Kaur considered the question seriously, without the reflexive alarm he half expected from her. "Then I hope you build it the way we built ours," she said. "Slowly, carefully, by people who understand exactly what they're responsible for, and who spend more of their time hoping they never have to use it than planning for the day they will. I won't pretend that wouldn't complicate things between us, but I'd rather share a galaxy with a hegemony that learned patience from watching us than one that just learned it should have moved faster. The first kind of neighbor I can work with. I've met the second kind before, in smaller versions, and it never ends anywhere good for anyone." He asked her, before the meeting closed, whether the cradle could be fired again. Not at that moment, but in principle, whether the 11-hour recharge was a hard limit or a chosen one. She didn't answer immediately, and when she did, it was with the same unhurried honesty she'd brought to everything else. "It's a hard limit," she said. "The star's magnetic cycle sets it. We didn't build an extra restraint on top of the physics. We didn't need to. 22 years taught us that the physics itself was already a kind of discipline, if you let it be. You don't get to want something faster than the system allows. You just get to decide, in the meantime, what kind of species you're going to be while you wait." Quick note before we finish this one. If you want to see more of this universe, the council hearings, what came after, let me know in the comments. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. New stories every week. News of the engagement reached the free rim within weeks. The loose network of trade routes, mercenary bands, and unaligned colonies where hegemony authority was strongest in theory and weakest in enforcement. For most of them, the hegemony had never been a government so much as weather, an enormous, indifferent pressure you planned around because resistance had never, in living memory, produced anything but a shorter version of the same eventual outcome. A Varathi trade envoy, addressing a Rim-World gathering months later, put it in terms later quoted across a dozen independent networks. "We have spent generations being told that resistance was a delay, not an answer. The humans did not resist. They built something so far past the need for resistance that resistance became the wrong word for what happened. Not every reaction along the rim was admiring. A number of independent colonies, wary of trading one dominant power for another, spent the following years quietly diversifying their trade relationships and defensive postures, unwilling to assume that a species capable of building the cradle would necessarily remain content with the restraint it had shown once." Kaur, when asked about that wariness directly, didn't dismiss it. "They're right to watch us the same way they watched the hegemony," she said. "Trust isn't something you earn with one decision. It's something you earn by making the same decision again, correctly, for as long as anyone's paying attention. We understand that. It's the same lesson the cradle itself was built on, a separate account, less widely circulated but taken seriously by historians on both sides, came from a Kellen trade consortium that had spent decades operating along the contested border, and had, in the years before the engagement, developed its own quiet contingency plans for a hegemony conflict it assumed was only a matter of time. Its senior negotiator, in a memoir published long after the fact, described her own reaction to the news less as relief than as recalculation. "We had spent 15 years planning for the day the hegemony finally decided we were worth conquering rather than merely taxing," she wrote. "We had never once planned for the day someone else in this galaxy proved they didn't have to be conquered at all. It took us longer than I am comfortable admitting to understand that the second scenario changed more about our future than the first ever would have." The Hegemony Council understood belatedly that the engagement's political cost had already exceeded its military one. 9 ships and their crews could be mourned, and eventually replaced. What couldn't be rebuilt so easily was the quiet, load-bearing assumption, held along every contested border for 6 centuries, that the hegemony simply couldn't lose in a way that mattered. The council split along 3 broad positions in the months that followed. One faction argued for immediate, overwhelming retaliation, a position that lost most of its support once hegemony engineers confirmed, independently and with visible reluctance, that no existing technology could reliably intercept a cradle-class weapon, and that building a countermeasure would require a scale of patient, coordinated investment the hegemony's own political culture had never demonstrated much appetite for. A second, smaller faction argued for total withdrawal from every contested territory bordering human space, a position that gained traction less from fear than from something closer to professional respect. The third, which eventually carried the vote, settled on something narrower: formal recognition of Sol system sovereignty, an end to hegemony expansion into the surrounding contested space, and, almost as an afterthought that several council members later admitted including out of genuine curiosity, an open invitation for scientific exchange. Grand Marshal Vei Ashen retired 18 months later, 2 grades below what his record otherwise earned, the unofficial political cost of having presided over the largest single engagement loss in 6 centuries of hegemony military history. He didn't contest it. He spent his retirement reading everything he could find about Project Cradle's engineering history, and eventually corresponded briefly with Winiarski. "I kept looking for the moment it became a weapon," he wrote, in one of his final letters before his death some years later. "I understand now I was asking the wrong question. It was never a weapon that happened to be very large. It was patience that happened to be capable eventually of ending a war in 4.1 seconds. I do not think my species has ever built anything out of patience alone. I am not certain we know how." Winiarski's reply, published later with his family's permission, was 3 sentences long. "It's not a hard thing to learn. It's just a slow one. Most people give up before it starts paying off. In the years that followed, the cradle itself was never fired again. Not because tensions along the border vanished, but because its existence had already done the work that firing it a second time would only have undermined. Trade routes opened, cautiously, under close mutual observation. A small, carefully vetted group of hegemony engineers was eventually granted supervised access to portions of the cradle's declassified schematics, in exchange for reciprocal access to hegemony shielding research, an exchange neither side entirely trusted, and both pursued anyway, on the theory that mutual technical transparency was, whatever its risks, considerably less dangerous than the alternative had already proven to be. The first joint delegation of hegemony engineers to walk the array bays on the second planet arrived, by design, on an unremarkable Tuesday, escorted not by a military honor guard, but by a rotating team of the same working engineers who had maintained the system for over 2 decades. There was no ceremony. There was a tour, a series of technical briefings, and a shared meal in a cafeteria that had fed containment crews through every shift of the project's history, still serving the same unremarkable food it always had. One of the visiting engineers, asked afterward what had struck her most, didn't mention the scale of the arrays or the elegance of the containment mathematics. She mentioned the cafeteria, the fact that a species capable of ending a war in 4 seconds had built, at the center of the machine that made it possible, a room designed for nothing more dramatic than people eating lunch together at the end of a long shift. Des Corrivan's warning during the countdown, confirmed independently, flagged correctly, delayed 11 minutes by a command chain that hadn't moved fast enough to matter, became, after the fact, the basis for a structural change to hegemony doctrine. Any officer confirming an independent corroborating threat assessment would gain standing authority to escalate directly to Fleet Command, bypassing the layered chain that had cost the fleet 11 minutes it couldn't afford to lose. It became known to her lasting and mild embarrassment as the Corrivan Protocol. The review board that recommended the change was, by the standards of hegemony institutional culture, unusually direct in its language. Its final report noted that Corrivan had done, in the driest and most literal sense, everything correctly, confirmed the threat independently, escalated it through every required channel, continued escalating it with appropriate urgency for the full 11 minutes it took her warning to travel a command structure that had not been designed with this kind of time pressure in mind, and that no reasonable officer in her position could have done more. The report went on, in a passage several senior officers found uncomfortable to read, to observe that the fleet's losses were not in any meaningful sense a failure of intelligence. They were a failure of architecture, a chain of command built for a galaxy where warnings had time to travel slowly, deployed against an adversary who had spent 22 years ensuring they would not. She was transferred some years later to a hegemony liaison office newly established to maintain communication with the Sol system, and met Kor exactly once, at a diplomatic function neither particularly wanted to attend. "You flagged the numbers twice before anyone senior would listen," Carr said once Corrivan admitted somewhat sheepishly who she was. "That's the same thing our containment engineers were doing for 22 years. Nobody remembers their names either. I think that might just be what competence looks like most of the time. Quiet, and mostly ignored, right up until the moment it isn't." "It didn't feel like competence," Corrivan said. "It felt like being terrified, and filling out the correct form anyway." Carr considered that for a moment. "Yeah, that tracks. I don't think there's actually a difference between those two things. I think competence is just what fear looks like once you've decided the form still needs filling out." Somewhere in the Joint Defense Council's declassified archive, filed not under military history but under the far less glamorous heading of systems engineering, sits a single maintenance log from year 6 of Project Cradle, the fluctuation, the 90 seconds, the 4-second margin, fluctuation resolved, resuming schedule. By most measures, it's the least interesting document in the entire archive. It's the one Kor chose, when asked years later what single artifact best explained how humanity had actually won a war. Most of the galaxy didn't know it was fighting. "Everyone wants the story to be about the 4 seconds, she said. It was never about the 4 seconds. It was about the 22 years of Tuesdays that made the 4 seconds possible. A species that had, somewhere along the way, quietly decided that showing up correctly on an unremarkable Tuesday mattered more than being impressive on the day everyone was watching. I don't know how to make that sound cinematic. I'm not sure it's supposed to. I just know it's true, and I know it's the only reason any of us are still here to tell the story at all. Winiarski, asked once by a young journalist whether he ever regretted spending the best years of his career on a project that might, had history gone only slightly differently, have never been used at all, thought about the question for longer than she expected. No, he said eventually. If the hegemony had never crossed that line and the whole project had just sat there quietly for another 50 years doing nothing but existing, I'd call that a complete success. Better than the one we got, honestly. The point was never the 4 seconds. The point was that for 22 years, nobody in the system had to be afraid, because we knew, quietly, privately, without needing anyone else to know it, that we had an answer ready if the question ever got asked. It means we stopped needing the galaxy's permission to be taken seriously. That's the whole thing. Everything else, the physics, the planets, the 22 years. That's just the part it took to get there. Years after the engagement, a small museum was opened on the second planet, not far from the array that had nearly failed in year 6. It was, by design, an unremarkable building, a converted section of the original engineering complex, left largely as it had been during the project itself, rather than rebuilt into something grander. Visitors walked past preserved consoles, faded checklists still pinned to the walls in places, and a single, carefully lit display case containing nothing more dramatic than a printed copy of a maintenance log. 6 years into the project, 4 seconds from disaster. Fluctuation resolved. Resuming schedule. The museum's curator, in an early interview, was asked why the exhibit had been built around such deliberately unglamorous artifacts rather than a full-scale replica of the cradle itself, or dramatic renderings of the strike that had ended a war. Her answer became, in time, something close to the museum's unofficial motto, printed on a small placard near the entrance that most visitors read on their way out, rather than on their way in. Because the strike isn't what we want people to remember, she said. Anyone can be told a story about a single dramatic moment and feel something for an afternoon. We wanted them to walk through 22 years of ordinary rooms first and understand by the time they reached the end that the dramatic moment was never the hard part. The hard part was everything that happened before anyone was watching. Reva Okonkwo Lindqvist, the materials specialist who had lived through the year 6 fluctuation firsthand, was among the museum's earliest visitors, and later admitted she'd approached the display case with more apprehension than she expected. She had spent decades trying not to think too hard about those 90 seconds. Standing in front of the 6 words that summarized them, printed and framed and lit for strangers to read, she found she didn't feel the alarm she'd braced for. She felt instead something closer to recognition, the particular quiet satisfaction of watching an institution finally tell the truth about what its own success had actually been built from. It was never going to be a statue of someone looking heroic, she said. It was always going to be 6 words on a log sheet. I think that's the only honest monument this project could have had. Grand Marshal Vayashin visited that museum once, quietly, near the end of his life, unannounced and without any of the ceremony his former rank might once have commanded. He spent most of the visit in front of that same display case, reading the same 6 words several times over, and told the docent accompanying him when she finally worked up the courage to ask if he needed anything, that he was fine, that he was simply trying, one last time, to understand a species that had built peace the same careful way it built everything else, slowly, correctly, and without needing anyone to be impressed along the way. He asked her before he left whether many hegemony visitors came through. She told him a handful did most years, usually alone, usually quiet the way he was. He nodded at that, as though it confirmed something he'd suspected but hadn't been certain of, and said nothing further. On his way out, he paused once more at the entrance placard. The dramatic moment was never the hard part, and stood there long enough that the docent, watching from a respectful distance, wondered whether he intended to say something. He didn't. He simply read it again, The way a man rereads a sentence he expects to keep returning to for the rest of his life, and then walked out into the ordinary daylight of a planet that had once very nearly not survived its own patience. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. Genuinely means a lot. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, subscribe for more HFY stories every week, and let me know down in the comments what you want to see explored next in this universe. See you in the next one.